Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind, and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight, we'll drift into a question that sits somewhere between science and dreaming, between the familiar steps of your daily life and the deep, still places your mind of visits when the world grows silent. Our journey will gently explore the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the echoes you feel in dreams, in intuition, or in moments that seem to repeat themselves might be tiny ripples from parallel versions of you, living out other possibilities in the vast, branching landscape of the multiverse. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see the little constellation we form together, each person in their own gentle corner of the night. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let your breath fall into an easy rhythm as we begin this quiet wander through the idea of parallel selves. And if your mind starts to drift, that's perfectly fine. Let it wander, we'll still be here, unfolding the story at a peaceful pace. Tonight's path opens with a simple, familiar experience, the strange borderland between dreaming and waking. It's a place everyone has visited, though few linger long enough to really look around. And that is where our first gentle step begins. There are nights when sleep feels like a soft descent, a drifting down through layers of thought until the world grows muted and everything inside you loosens. And then, without warning, you find yourself standing somewhere that feels curiously real, more real even than the room you fell asleep in. It might be a house whose walls you've never seen, but whose corners feel familiar in a way that touches something deep in your chest. Or perhaps you walk along a street lined with faces you do not know, yet every step feels like returning to a story you left unfinished long ago. It is in these moments, these vivid, strangely coherent dreams, that many people first feel the gentle tug of what we're exploring tonight. Not the loud call of fantasy, not the bright shine of imagination, but something quieter, more grounded, something that feels like memory of a place you've never been, memory of a life you never lived here, in this timeline, in this version of yourself. When morning comes, the dream may cling to you like mist, to your thoughts, your emotions, even to the simple act of opening your eyes. You may sit on the edge of the bed wondering why your heart aches for a conversation that never happened, or why you feel nostalgic for someone you've never met. And although the daylight fades these impressions, a part of you keeps turning back to them, as though they hold a thread that hasn't yet been followed. Dreams like this are not simply stories stitched together by a wandering mind. Neuroscience tells us that during certain phases of sleep, the brain lights up in ways that resemble waking, especially in the regions that interpret emotion, place, and personal meaning. This is why a dream can feel so startlingly vivid. But even when we translate that into gentle scientific language, the emotional weight remains. The dream lingers because it touched something that feels like truth. Some describe these dreams as glimpses of an alternate life, like visiting a room in a house built on the same foundation as your own, but decorated by a different version of you. Others say it feels as if two rivers that normally flow apart have, for a few hours, brushed their currents together. Perhaps that is one way to think about it, a brushing between branches of possibility. In the vast tapestry of the many worlds idea, each choice, each chance, each turning point leads to countless new paths. You continue along one, while other versions of you follow the others. It's a scientific theory rendered in soft strokes. The notion that the universe doesn't collapse possibilities into a single outcome, but lets them all bloom. And if that is true, if reality spreads out like a branching forest, then perhaps these hyper-real dreams are the rustling of leaves from nearby paths, Not full communication, not an exchange of data, but a faint shimmer of resonance. A moment where your awareness leans a little too close to another version of itself. This doesn't mean that your parallel self is speaking to you in words or symbols. Instead, it may be offering something more subtle, emotion without context, clarity without explanation, a sense of this is what it feels like, rather than this is what it is. Feelings often travel more easily than thoughts. They are softer, less rigid. They slip between boundaries the way light slips between curtains. Some people report a recurring landscape in their dreams, one that returns again and again over the years. A house with the same angle of sunlight on the floorboards. A coastline with waves that roll in with a rhythm too steady to be chance. A classroom where the chalkboard always has the same faint smudge in the corner. These consistencies are unusual in ordinary dreams, which tend to shuffle and recombine elements from memory. Yet here they are, steady, coherent, unfolding like chapters in a story that continues while you are away. It is in these recurrences that people often feel a quiet sense of being guided, not by an external force, but by a self that has walked a different path. The dream may be trying to show something, not in a symbolic puzzle, but in a feeling, hesitation, comfort, caution, longing. Instead of being told what to do, you are being invited to feel what another version of you has learned. This idea does not contradict science when approached gently. After all, the brain is a storyteller. It weaves together fragments of experience, memory, and possibility. It tries to make sense of the world, both the one you live in and the one you imagine. If there are parallel selves out there, other yous walking other paths, your dreaming mind may be the place where those distant silhouettes become faintly visible. And so, when you find yourself standing in a dream that feels more like a memory, or when you wake with the strange sense of having lived another life during the night, you might pause and listen to the emotional tone that lingers. It may be nothing more than your mind processing your own life, or it may be, just softly enough to matter, a whisper from a parallel you, reaching across the quiet spaces between realities, reminding you that your story is larger than the one you remember each morning. Let that thought settle gently as we continue our slow journey tonight, drifting from dreams toward the next subtle ripple of connection. There is a quiet kind of beauty in imagining that every moment of your life, every breath and every hesitation might open into a new direction. Not a dramatic split or a cosmic explosion, but something far gentler, like watching a river divide into two smaller streams, each one still carrying the same water, just moving toward different fields. This is one of the calmer ways to approach the idea that physicists sometimes call the branching universe. But tonight, rather than using abstract terms, we can think of it as a forest full of winding paths, each path a version of your life that might have unfolded. You can picture it softly. Every decision you've ever made, whether to leave the house a little earlier, whether to speak up or stay quiet, whether to take the job or turn it down, sending out subtle ripples. And with each ripple, the world around you adjusts, gently rearranging itself around the choice you stepped into. In one version you turned left, in another you turned right. In one you decided to postpone a conversation, in another you said what had been resting in your chest for months. And each of these small shifts carries you, without judgment, into a slightly different future. This, in its simplest form, is the heart of what the physicist Hugh Everett proposed many decades ago. He suggested that the universe doesn't choose one outcome over another, but simply lets all possible outcomes exist. Each one becomes its own branch, not visible to your eyes, yet woven into the larger fabric of reality. In this way, the universe doesn't collapse choices, it celebrates them, allowing every possibility to bloom somewhere. But if that idea feels too large or too technical, it may help to think of it another way. Imagine standing in a library late at night, long after everyone has gone home. The room is quiet. with only a faint hum of air moving through the shelves. You run your hand along the spines of the books, feeling their different textures. Now imagine that every book is a story of your life, one where you followed this dream, one where you stayed in that relationship, one where you found courage earlier, one where you found it later. You cannot read all the books at once, but you can sense that they are there, each one holding a version of you shaped by its own joys and mistakes. This is similar to what thinkers like Max Tegmark propose, the idea that in an infinite universe, there might be countless versions of you, each separated not by space, but by possibility. This doesn't mean that you're duplicated in any strange or unsettling way. It's more like the universe offering every seed a chance to grow, letting existence explore itself in a wide, branching way. If you were to ask whether these parallel versions of you are real, the answer depends on how you choose to look at the world. From a scientific viewpoint, it is a hypothesis, one that fits nicely with certain ideas in physics, but still sits gently in the realm of curiosity. From a philosophical viewpoint, it is an invitation to consider that the self is wider than a single timeline. And from an emotional viewpoint, it can be comforting to imagine that some part of you has walked paths you didn't take, carrying experiences and lessons that still belong to you, even if you never lived them directly. The next question, a softer one, is whether these parallel versions might ever brush close enough to be felt. Not in dramatic ways, no thunder, no flashing lights, no bending of the world, but in the smallest moments, an idea that arrives fully formed, a dream that feels like walking through a memory, a sudden knowing that you cannot logically explain. If we continue with the metaphor of the library, it might be like hearing a faint whisper from a nearby aisle, not in words, but in a feeling. This mattered. This changed me. This is part of us. Some physicists talk about the underlying fabric of the universe as something like a vast ocean of probabilities. Choices are like waves rising from that ocean, gently cresting into form, and if you think of it that way, then the many worlds idea becomes less like a hard scientific claim and more like a poetic way to describe the openness of reality. Every thought you have, every path you consider sends out a ripple. Most of these ripples fade, but some become strong enough to guide you. And perhaps, in the quietest moments, you can feel the echoes of the ripples from other shores. To make this less abstract, imagine holding two mirrors facing each other. If you look closely, you will see not just one reflection, but many. A corridor of selves stretching into the distance. Now imagine that each reflection is slightly different, shaped by tiny shifts in expression or posture. You can't step into those reflections, but you can sense their presence. They are still you, even if they exist just beyond reach. This is a softened way to understand the many branches of reality. The gentle question we're exploring tonight is whether, under certain conditions, dreaming, quiet meditation, moments of deep intuition, the boundary between one reflection and another becomes thin enough for a feeling to pass through. Not thought, not memory, but something more fluid, a sense of recognition, or a tug of emotion that doesn't belong only to this life. You may have felt this in those lingering dreams from our first session, or in moments of déjà vu that catch you off guard. You may feel it in repeated symbols or coincidences that seem to fold around you like a pattern. These experiences do not prove anything about parallel worlds, but they invite us to consider that consciousness might be more spacious than we imagine. If the universe does indeed hold many versions of your story, then it might also hold a subtle way for those stories to resonate with one another, like distant wind chimes responding to the same passing breeze. And as we drift further into tonight's journey, we'll explore how those resonances sometimes appear in ordinary life, arriving softly, without urgency, as though a parallel you is leaning just close enough to leave a faint trace on your path. Let your breath remain easy as we move into that next gentle ripple, following the thread of these subtle signs. There are certain ideas that feel too large to hold all at once, so the mind approaches them the way a person walks toward the ocean at night, slowly, letting the sound reach them first, then the coolness of the air, and only finally the reflection of moonlight on the waves. The nature of consciousness is one of those ideas. Scientists, philosophers, and dreamers have all tried to understand what awareness truly is, and yet it continues to shimmer just out of reach, like something that prefers to be noticed gently rather than grasped. Most of us grow up thinking of consciousness as something contained within the skull, like a lantern tucked behind bone. We flick it on in the morning, navigate the day, and let it dim again when sleep takes over. But people throughout history, from mystics to physicists, have suggested that consciousness may not be a simple switch, nor something locked in one location. Instead, they imagine it as something more spacious, something that spreads out, the way warmth radiates from a quiet fire. One way to picture this is to imagine a field of tall grass on a calm evening. When the wind moves through it, the grass leans, sways, and returns to stillness. You don't see the wind itself, you see its influence, the way it carries a soft message across the field. Some thinkers propose that consciousness might resemble this kind of field, not something contained, but something that moves, touches, and responds. Not a thing, but a presence. A physicist named David Bohm once spoke about the universe in terms of hidden layers, where the world we see is like the unfolded surface of a deeper, more intricate reality. He imagined that everything we experience, thoughts, sensations, even time, emerges from an inner order that is woven beneath ordinary perception. We don't need technical language to understand this. You can think of it as a piece of fabric folded many times, where the folds touch each other even when their surfaces appear separate. When you unfold it, these hidden connections reveal themselves as the patterns on the cloth. If consciousness belongs partly to these deeper layers, then what we experience as thoughts might be only the surface ripples of something more expansive, and if that is true, the idea of parallel selves stops feeling like a distant scientific concept and starts to become something more intimate. Because if awareness extends beyond the brain, then perhaps different versions of you, woven through those deeper layers, are closer to each other than physical distance or separate timelines would suggest. Another physicist, Eugene Wigner, once wondered whether consciousness might play a role in shaping the reality we observe. Instead of imagining the world as fixed and solid, he pictured the moment we notice something as the moment it becomes definite. We can translate this into soft language. The world waits in a kind of stillness, and your attention is like a gentle touch that encourages one possibility to settle into form. Not through force, but through presence. If attention truly has the power to encourage reality in this way, then consciousness is not just something that experiences the world, it participates in it. It meets it halfway. That is a tender thought, and one that makes the idea of parallel selves feel less abstract. Because if your awareness helps shape the path you walk, then perhaps the awareness of another you, on another path, shapes their world too. And if awareness is something spacious and interconnected, then the quiet influence between those paths might happen in ways we don't yet fully understand. Some people describe moments when their mind feels unusually open, a sense of clarity that arrives without effort. It might happen during meditation, or during a walk at dusk, or even during the few seconds before falling asleep. These moments can feel like the boundary between the self and the world has softened, almost as if awareness has stretched beyond its usual shape. In these times, ideas come more easily, intuition feels louder, and the mind seems to listen to subtle signals it usually ignores. These experiences can be explained in many ways, through psychology, through brain states, or through the simple act of stillness. But they also align with the idea of consciousness as something that extends outward. If the mind is not a lantern but a field, then the space around you becomes part of the conversation. And if the space around you holds the faint echoes of other possibilities, other branches of your own life, then perhaps those echoes move through the field as softly as wind through grass. Consider those moments when a thought arrives fully formed without any clear origin. You might be washing dishes or tying your shoes or looking out a window when suddenly you feel certain about a decision you've been wrestling with, or you feel a quiet warning or a subtle pull toward a different direction. These gentle nudges are often dismissed as intuition, but the concept of a field-like consciousness allows us to imagine that these moments might be more than coincidence. They could be small resonances from versions of you who have already walked further along this particular path. This is not to say that parallel selves send messages in any literal sense. There is no telegraph of the soul, no cosmic phone line connecting one timeline to another. But if awareness operates beyond a single timeline, if it touches the deeper folds of reality, then those folds might carry emotional traces, wisdom, or impressions that drift between possibilities like soft currents. And there is something soothing about imagining consciousness this way. Instead of being alone inside one narrow life, you are part of a wider, more spacious existence. You belong not just to a single path, but to a family of paths, each one exploring a different version of your story. And perhaps these paths are not silent to one another. Perhaps they hum softly beneath the noise of daily life, sharing what they've learned in the only language subtle enough to travel across worlds: feelings, intuition, dreams, and the gentle pull of possibility. If you let that idea rest beside you for a moment, you may notice that it doesn't demand belief. It only invites reflection. It offers a softer way to imagine the mind, not as an isolated island, but as something like a wide horizon touched by many dawns. And as we move forward, we'll explore how this horizon may allow the quiet signals from those parallel selves to reach you, weaving into your life in ways that feel both mysterious and strangely familiar. There comes a moment when wandering through these ideas where curiosity quietly leans forward and asks a question that feels both simple and immense. If there are truly many versions of your life unfolding in the vast branching of reality, each one shaped by choices you made or didn't make, could those distant selves ever reach across the space that separates them? Not in dramatic or supernatural ways, but in the subtle language of experience, a dream that feels borrowed, an intuition that feels older than you, a feeling that drifts in as if carried from somewhere you've never been. This question doesn't ask us to abandon science or logic. Instead, it invites us to consider the nature of awareness itself and whether its edges are as firm as we assume. We spend much of our daily life believing that our thoughts begin and end inside our own minds, yet certain moments challenge that boundary, hinting that awareness may not be a sealed container, but something more fluid, something that can stretch, resonate, or tune itself to quiet signals from beyond the narrow corridor of ordinary perception. To understand this, it may help to imagine a still lake at dusk. When you toss a pebble into the water, ripples move outward in widening circles. Now imagine another pebble dropped somewhere else on that same lake. If the ripples meet, they create a pattern, a momentary dance of waves rising and falling together. These patterns don't mean the two stones communicated on purpose, or even knew of each other. They simply share the same surface, the same body of water. In a gentle way, some thinkers imagine consciousness as a shared surface like this. Not that your thoughts blend with everyone else's, but that all minds rise from a deeper layer of reality, the way waves rise from the same lake. And if this is true, then the various versions of you that exist across different branches of possibility might also rise from that deeper layer. Their experiences, their emotions, their lessons could create subtle ripples within that shared foundation. Sometimes, when your mind is calm enough, you may feel one of those ripples touch your awareness. You might have felt this during a sudden sense of clarity, when a decision you've been struggling with suddenly feels simple, as though someone had already lived through the consequences for you. or during a moment of empathy so strong it surprises you, as though you recognize an emotion that doesn't seem to come from your current life. These experiences are often brushed aside as intuition or imagination, but they may be something more delicate, signals from a version of you who has already walked further along the path you're facing. This doesn't mean that timelines blend with one another. The branches of reality, if they exist, remain distinct. But just as leaves at the end of different branches still share the same trunk, the deeper roots of awareness might connect those branches in ways we cannot see. What one version of you learns might send a faint tremor through those roots, and another version, this version, might feel that tremor without knowing where it came from. To translate this idea into softer terms, think of a room with several wind chimes hanging from the ceiling. Each chime has a slightly different tone, a slightly different length of metal tube. When the air shifts, the chimes respond. One begins to ring, and its vibration, in turn, sets another chime trembling softly. They are not touching, they are not speaking, yet they resonate. Their movements influence one another through the shared air around them. Some scientists use similar imagery when talking about probability, how certain possibilities may lean. Toward others, how choices may gently influence which events become more likely. If your awareness is part of a larger interconnected field, then your thoughts and feelings might also participate in this subtle leaning. When a parallel self encounters something meaningful, the emotional tone of that experience might ripple outward, brushing your consciousness in a way that feels like déjà vu, synchronicity, or the quiet push of intuition. You may have noticed moments when life seems to nudge you toward a choice. A book falls open to the exact page you needed. A conversation drifts toward a topic that has been resting heavily in your mind. A stranger's comment echoes a thought you've kept hidden. These little alignments don't prove the existence of parallel universes, but they suggest that life might have more coherence than randomness. Perhaps these moments occur because your inner world is tuning itself to a wider pattern, one that includes not just your timeline, but many timelines where other versions of you are learning, growing, and encountering their own turning points. Some people call this guidance, others call it coincidence, but another way to see it is as resonance, the faint blending of different paths within the larger field of consciousness. The emotional quality of these moments often feels more important than the details. You might not remember the words someone said, but you remember how they made you feel. You might not recall the dream exactly, but you remember the impression it left on your heart. These impressions may come from your own deep mind, or they may come from a version of you living another possibility, whispering through the spaces where awareness touches awareness. This idea becomes easier to imagine when your life reaches a crossroads, during transitions, moving to a new place, ending a relationship, starting a new chapter. Your sense of self becomes more fluid. You're more open, more reflective. In these moments, you may feel guidance more clearly, as though something in the world is aligning with your inner questions. A different version of you may have already lived through this transition, learned its lessons, and is now sending you a gentle emotional map. Not instructions, not commands, only the emotional outline of a path that led to growth, or healing, or understanding. And so the bridge between lives is not a physical tunnel or a mystical gateway. It is a quiet, subtle resonance, carried through the deeper layers of awareness that all versions of you may share. You might never feel it directly. You might only sense it through dreams, through intuition, through moments that make you pause and wonder. But if you listen with a gentle, open mind, you may notice that these subtle signals have always been there, like distant bells ringing softly across a valley at dusk. As you settle into this thought, let it remain soft and unhurried. There is no need to insist on certainty. The beauty of these possibilities lies not in proving them, but in allowing them to open the heart to wonder. And from this place of quiet curiosity, we can drift forward into the first of the 7 signs that these subtle resonances may be touching your life, beginning with the landscapes that appear when your eyes close and the world dims into dreaming. There are some dreams that do not feel like dreams at all. They feel like places you return to, quietly, repeatedly, like a town you once lived in, or a home you left behind. You may find yourself walking through a corridor that your waking mind doesn't recognize, yet every detail in the dream feels intimately familiar. The pattern of sunlight on the floor, the exact creak of a wooden step, the way the air moves through a window that seems to open into another climate, another season, another rhythm of life entirely. Most dreams fade quickly, dissolving into a soft blur the moment morning arrives. But the dreams we are speaking of tonight are different. They linger, they resist fading, they hold a kind of internal consistency, as if the dream is not inventing the world as it goes, but simply revealing a place that already exists. You might wander the same streets night after night, noticing new turns but recognizing the landmarks. You might speak to people who feel strangely important, as if your connection with them stretches beyond the boundaries of any single dream. You may even feel the weather there, or the texture of cloth against your hands, with a clarity that surprises you. These dreams have an emotional weight, the kind that pulls gently at the edges of your waking life. You wake with a yearning you cannot quite explain, or with a peacefulness that feels borrowed from somewhere else. Sometimes you wake with tears, not because the dream was sad, but because it was meaningful, and the meaning followed you through the thin curtain between sleep and waking. Science offers one explanation for why certain dreams feel so vivid. During a stage of sleep known as REM, the brain becomes almost as active as it is when you are awake. The regions that interpret emotion and memory glow softly with activity, creating landscapes rich in feeling and detail. But even if we accept this gentle biological explanation, it does not take away from the strange familiarity of these recurring dream worlds. If anything, it highlights how powerful these inner landscapes can be, how real they feel, how deeply they resonate. Some people describe these dreams as chapters in an unfolding story. Each night adds a new thread, a new conversation, a new moment of clarity. Over months or even years, a parallel life begins to take shape in the dark. You might have friendships in that dream world that do not exist here. You might have routines, responsibilities, or memories there that have nothing to do with your waking life. And yet your heart recognizes them all, as though you're living two stories at once. It is in these recurring dreamscapes that the idea of parallel selves begins to feel less like speculation and more like a quiet possibility. If the universe truly contains many versions of your life, then perhaps dreams are the place where the boundaries between those versions become thin enough to see through. Not in a direct, literal sense, no physical bridge, no tunnel of light, but in the emotional sense, where your inner world becomes a window to paths not taken and experiences lived elsewhere. In this way, some dreams may not be messages in the traditional sense. They may be emotional reflections drifting toward you across the deeper layers of consciousness. The information they carry is not literal. It arrives in the form of tone, atmosphere, instinct. When you dream of a conversation with someone you've never met here, the message may not be the words spoken, but the feeling of connection, or hesitation, or wisdom that rises between you. When you return to the same dream place, the message may be continuity itself, the sense that somewhere a version of you is living a life that you can feel but not fully name. You might think of these dreams as emotional packets, soft bundles of experience sent not in language but in sensation. They are not instructions or commands. They do not tell you what to do. They simply offer you the feeling of having been through something without needing to explain it. And sometimes that feeling is exactly what you need when facing a challenge or a crossroads in your waking life. Imagine for a moment that each dream is like a small boat drifting across a foggy lake. You cannot see the other shore, but the boat reaches you anyway, carrying whatever it carries. Some nights it may bring comfort, other nights it may bring questions. There are nights when it brings courage, And there are nights when it brings the soft ache of things you've never lived but somehow understand. Dream incubation, the practice of gently inviting a dream before you sleep, can sometimes open this channel more clearly, not as a mystical technique, but as a quiet conversation with your own mind. When you ask a question before sleep and wake with a dream that feels like an answer, you are witnessing the mind's ability to organize emotion into imagery. But some describe a deeper feeling, as if the dream answers not from their present self, but from a wiser, more experienced version of who they could become. This idea does not require belief in parallel worlds. It simply invites us to accept that the dreaming mind is vast, and perhaps connected to layers of possibility that waking life rarely touches. When you revisit the same dream world again and again, you might be walking through the emotional architecture of a life that exists in potential, a life that another version of you is living, learning from, and feeling deeply. These dreams do not ask for interpretation. They simply ask to be noticed, to be felt, to be allowed to rest at the edge of your waking thoughts like a memory from childhood, half remembered, half imagined, yet undeniably real in the heart. If ever you wake and feel that a dream was not just a dream, perhaps it was a quiet whisper from a self walking another path, and perhaps, in ways we do not yet understand, that whisper is meant to help you on this path too. There are moments in life that unfold with such uncanny familiarity that you pause mid-step, unsure whether you're moving forward in time or quietly retracing a memory you have somehow forgotten. It might happen when you enter a room for the first time, yet every detail, the height of the ceiling, the sound of distant traffic, the particular angle of the sunlight, feels unmistakably known. Or you sit down with someone new, and as they begin to speak, you feel a subtle tug inside your chest, as if you have already lived this conversation long ago in a place you cannot name. This quiet jolt of recognition is what we call déjà vu, a French phrase meaning already seen. But the experience is not merely visual. It has layers. It carries a softness, a certainty, a whisper of familiarity that doesn't quite belong to your current life. For a few seconds, the world feels doubled, as though two versions of a moment, one lived now and one lived elsewhere, briefly layer on top of each other like transparent pages. Science has gentle explanations for this phenomenon. Some researchers describe it as a moment when two internal systems fall out of sync, one that registers familiarity and one that stores detailed memory. When the system that recognizes patterns fires a moment earlier than the system that retrieves memories, your mind may produce a feeling of "I've been here before" without any actual memory attached. It is a soft misalignment, like two dancers who step into a movement slightly out of rhythm, creating a fleeting moment where the choreography feels familiar yet unplaceable. This explanation is calming, and it fits well with what we know about how the brain organizes experience. Yet even when we understand this, the emotional quality of déjà vu remains something altogether more mysterious. There is a peculiar clarity to it, a sense that the moment is not just familiar, but aligned, almost as if two streams of experience are brushing against each other, creating a shimmer where they meet. One way to imagine this is to picture a still lake at dawn. If you toss two pebbles into the water from different angles, their ripples will eventually cross. When they do, the wave patterns blend for just a heartbeat, creating a moment of graceful interference, one that belongs fully to neither pebble, yet emerges from them both. Déjà vu often feels like this kind of crossing, a moment of resonance between two paths, two interpretations of the same experience, or perhaps two versions of you walking different timelines that briefly align. This doesn't mean that parallel selves step into your world or deliver dramatic revelations. Instead, the alignment is emotional, not literal. It is a sensation, a soft hum in the chest, a feeling that the moment carries weight or significance, or a kind of recognition that is older than memory. In those few seconds, you may sense the presence of a life not lived here, but lived somewhere. A version of you who already stood in that very moment, or something like it, long before you arrived. Some people describe déjà vu as a memory of a dream. They recall dreaming about a place that later appears in waking life, with details too exact to be coincidence. Others say it feels like stepping into a scene from a forgotten story. And for a few, it feels as though they are momentarily walking in step with another self, someone who has already lived this moment and is quietly guiding their attention toward it. If you consider the many worlds idea, déjà vu can take on another layer of meaning. If reality truly branches into countless versions with each choice, big or small, then perhaps these moments of recognition are places where the branches grow very close together. Like two neighbouring paths in a forest that almost touch, separated only by a thin layer of leaves. When you pass through such a place, you may feel the presence of the other path, even if you cannot see it. Maybe the air feels slightly different, or the sound of your own footsteps seems to echo strangely. You cannot explain it, yet you feel it. Déjà vu can also arrive with a brief sense of knowing what comes next. You may open your mouth to speak and feel strangely certain about the next word someone else will say. It may last only seconds, fading the moment you notice it. But within those seconds lies a profound sense that time is not as rigid as it appears, that your awareness brushed gently against a version of events already lived in another timeline. Of course, not every déjà vu has this depth. Many are simply the mind replaying familiar patterns, but some carry a sharp emotional clarity that is difficult to dismiss. These special ones do not just say, "I've been here before," they say, "I've been here in another way," and that difference, quiet, subtle, barely noticeable unless you pay attention, makes them feel like soft messages, hints from a life adjacent to your own. It can be comforting to imagine that a parallel self might send a faint echo through the fabric of consciousness, nudging you toward awareness at a moment that matters. Perhaps the version of you on another branch made a choice that didn't go well, and the emotional imprint of that moment reaches you as a warning. Or perhaps they found a path that brought peace or clarity, and the echo you feel is encouragement, a gentle push toward alignment. These impressions do not arrive in language. They arrive as sensation, as a shift in attention, as a moment where the world feels more vivid than usual, as though someone turned up the brightness on reality for just a breath. When déjà vu visits, you might pause and simply notice its texture, not to analyze it or decode it, but to feel what it carries. Does it come with calmness, with hesitation, with a sense that this moment matters? Those emotions may be the message, not the logic, not the details, the feeling. In this way, déjà vu becomes more than a neurological glitch. It becomes a soft place where the borders between possibilities thin and where you might sense the presence of another self living a parallel storyline. Whether you see this as science, psychology, philosophy, or quiet imagination, the experience remains the same, a moment where two ripples touch, and for a heartbeat, you feel connected to something larger than one timeline. As we drift forward, we move from these inner flashes of recognition to another subtle whisper. The patterns that appear not within your mind, but within the world around you, arranging themselves into synchronicities that seem almost too timely to ignore. There are moments in life when the world seems to lean toward you, quietly, subtly, almost shyly, and offer a pattern so perfectly timed that it feels as though it was placed there on purpose. These moments do not shout. They do not announce themselves. Instead, they arrive the way a single leaf might drift down onto your path just as you're wondering which direction to take. You notice the leaf not because it is extraordinary, but because it appears at the exact right instant. Synchronicities feel like that. Small events lining up so gracefully that they form a thread, a tiny constellation guiding your attention. Perhaps you've experienced something like hearing the same unusual phrase 3 times in one day, from 3 unrelated sources. Or maybe a particular number follows you, appearing on clocks, receipts, passing cars, and the edges of your awareness, each time at a moment when you're pondering a decision or wrestling with an emotion. There are times when a song seems to rise out of nowhere just as your thoughts drift to a person you miss, or a question you have been avoiding. You may hear that song again in the store, again on the street, again in a stranger's humming. It is as if the world is gently tapping your shoulder, inviting you to pay attention. These experiences do not need to be dramatic to feel significant. Often, the smaller they are, the more they seem to matter. They feel like the universe clearing its throat softly, as if to say, "Look here." But the message is rarely literal. The meaning lies in the timing, not in the event itself. A book falling off a shelf is just gravity, but doing so at the exact moment you are thinking of calling someone you've lost touch with may feel like a nudge, a reminder, or a whisper. There are simple ways to understand this phenomenon. The human mind is naturally drawn to patterns. It filters thousands of pieces of information every minute, selecting the ones that resonate with your inner state. When you're thinking about a friend, you notice things connected to them. When you're anxious, you notice signs that confirm that anxiety. In this sense, synchronicity can be seen as your attention becoming unusually attuned to certain themes, making the world seem more coordinated than it truly is. But even this explanation holds a quiet kind of beauty. Your mind is not a passive observer. It participates in the moment, shaping what you notice, bringing certain details forward while letting others fade into the background. When your inner world is stirred by a question or a longing, the outer world often feels more responsive. You see connections where none would have registered before. And sometimes, these connections feel so precise that they seem to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary boundaries of thought. If we entertain the idea of parallel selves, synchronicities take on yet another layer of meaning. Imagine that each version of you moving through the branching forest of possibilities is creating subtle ripples, ripples made of emotion, insight, instinct. Those ripples may drift into the deeper layers of consciousness, the same way sound travels farther at dawn. And when your awareness brushes one of those ripples, you may find your attention pulled to certain symbols, numbers, words, or moments, not because the universe changed, but because your inner world momentarily aligned with a nearby branch. Imagine walking along a path in a quiet forest. You hear a distant step, far off to your left. You do not see the other path, but you sense something moving there. Your awareness sharpens, listening for the next sound. If parallel selves exist, and if their experiences leave impressions in the shared field of consciousness, then synchronicities might be the gentle echoes of their footsteps, subtle indications that something important is unfolding on another path, something that resonates with your own life. In this sense, synchronicities become emotional signposts. They don't tell you what to do, but they draw your attention to the crossroads where your choices matter. A repeated image might highlight a fear you've been avoiding. A phrase you keep hearing might illuminate a truth you haven't spoken. A pattern of numbers might appear when you are on the verge of an important realization. These are not commands. They are gentle reflections, mirrors placed along your path at moments when you're ready to see more clearly. Some people describe synchronicities as small miracles, but perhaps they are something even simpler. Subtle alignments between your inner landscape and the wider web of possibilities. When your emotions, intentions, or questions reach a certain depth, you become more receptive to signals that match those inner states. And if parallel selves are sending out their own emotional ripples, whether from wiser choices or learned mistakes, those ripples may influence which patterns catch your eye. Consider how often synchronicities appear when you're facing uncertainty. At such times, your boundaries soften. You're more open to guidance, whether from memory, intuition, or something deeper. You begin to notice things you would normally overlook, and a path that once felt tangled may begin to feel loosely illuminated. The clues are not clear instructions. They are more like lanterns placed along the edges of the road, soft, flickering lights that show you where the ground is steady. And sometimes synchronicities arrive after a decision is made, not before. They appear in clusters, almost as if affirming the direction you chose. 3 supportive messages from strangers, a sudden sense of relief, a symbol that holds personal meaning. These patterns feel like waves of reassurance, echoing through the deeper layers of self. Perhaps a parallel version of you has already walked this path and is sending back a subtle emotional signature that says, you are moving towards something true. In this way, synchronicities become the whispers of alignment, moments where your life feels briefly stitched to a wider tapestry of meaning. Whether they arise from psychology, probability, intuition, or the quiet resonance of parallel selves, their effect is the same. They encourage stillness. They encourage reflection. They encourage trust in the subtle currents that move beneath the surface of experience. And as we drift from these outward signs toward the next, we move deeper into a region where the whispers become more internal, moments of insight, talent, or understanding that arrive fully formed, as if carried from another room in the house of your own mind. There are moments when understanding arrives so quietly that it feels less like learning and more like remembering. You might be sitting with a problem that has puzzled you for weeks, turning it over in your mind, feeling your way through possibilities without finding a satisfying answer. And then one morning, perhaps while washing your face or tying your shoes, the answer appears fully shaped, like a seashell washed onto the shore overnight. It does not feel invented. It feels recovered. These moments can be as small as suddenly knowing how to phrase a difficult message, or as large as grasping a concept that once felt impossible, an idea in mathematics, or a pattern in music, or a sentence in a language you have never studied formally. Instead of climbing a staircase of effort, you find yourself already standing at the top, looking down at the steps you somehow skipped. Ordinarily, we explain such experiences through the hidden workings of the mind. We say that the subconscious has been slowly assembling pieces behind the scenes, letting them simmer until clarity appears. We say that old memories or forgotten experiences rise to the surface at the perfect moment. This kind of gentle explanation is not only plausible, it is beautiful in its own way. The mind is a quiet workshop full of unfinished projects that continue to take shape, even while we sleep or daydream. But there are times when this ordinary explanation feels incomplete. Sometimes the understanding that arrives does not resemble anything you have studied or heard before. There are moments when the insight feels foreign, as if borrowed from a mind that has walked further along the path than you have. You may notice a shift in your inner voice, the tone slightly different, the phrasing unfamiliar. It might feel as though you're listening to a wiser version of yourself, one who has already made the mistakes you're trying to avoid. Some people describe sudden artistic fluency. They begin to paint with a style they cannot trace to any teacher. They pick up an instrument and play with a sensitivity they didn't know they possessed. They write sentences that feel older than their own experiences, carrying emotional depth they cannot explain. In each case, the person does not feel like they are creating something new. They feel like they are recovering a lost ability. Others recall a moment when a complex concept becomes simple in an instant, not because they studied harder, but because something clicked. They may have struggled with a scientific idea, or a philosophical problem, or a personal dilemma. And then, without warning, the idea reveals itself in a single breath, as though a curtain has been drawn back. It is not a step-by-step realization. It is a sudden shift in perspective, like turning a kaleidoscope and watching scattered fragments snap into a perfect pattern. These experiences raise a quiet question. What if some insights come not from the depths of your current mind, but from the surface of another path? One walked by a parallel self who's already mastered the skill or solved the riddle. If consciousness has layers that connect across the folds of possibility, then perhaps wisdom can travel along these folds in ways we do not yet understand, not as words or lessons but as impressions, soft blueprints drifting across the inner horizon. Imagine for a moment that each version of you in the branching universe is like a painter working on a different canvas. Some canvases are rough sketches, others are nearly finished, some are bright, others subdued. But all of them belong to the same artist, you. And if one painter self discovers a technique, or learns a pattern, or develops an intuition, perhaps a faint echo of that learning can drift across the studio, reaching another canvas in the form of a sudden knowing. This does not require direct communication. It does not require a crossing of worlds. It only requires that consciousness is more spacious than we usually imagine, that its deeper layers might touch, sharing whispers of experience. On the surface, timelines are separate, but beneath the surface, the roots may intertwine. You may have sensed this during moments when your inner narrator seems to shift ever so slightly. The voice that usually speaks inside your mind takes on a different rhythm, or a gentler confidence, or a perspective you did not have yesterday. It may offer guidance you did not know you needed. It may steer you toward a solution without explaining how it knows. These moments feel like glimpses, not of another world, but of another state of yourself. There is a phenomenon often mistaken for this, when the mind retrieves something forgotten and presents it as new. But even when that is the case, the sensation of remembering what you never learned still carries a deep emotional truth. It reveals how vast the mind really is, and how little of its landscape we explore in daily life. Perhaps the most moving examples come from times of emotional transition, when a person suddenly knows how to let go, or how to forgive, or how to understand someone else's pain. These insights feel larger than the moment. They feel earned somehow, even if the path to earning them is hidden. In such moments, wisdom arrives as a soft weight on the heart, as if someone else has already lived through the lesson and is gently placing it into your hands. You might think of these sudden abilities as gentle gifts, not supernatural, not miraculous, but reflections. They reflect the possibility that somewhere, in another strand of your life, you have already learned what you're learning now. And through the hidden architecture of consciousness, one that may stretch across the boundaries of time and probability, a faint trace of that understanding finds its way to you. Whether you see these moments as echoes from parallel selves, or as the flowering of your own deep mind, their meaning remains the same. They remind you that you are larger than you know, that your potential extends beyond the limits of your memory, and that sometimes the most powerful wisdom is not taught, but remembered. As we drift further, we move from these sudden flashes of understanding to something more emotional, moments when your heart recognizes people or places long before your mind knows why. Sometimes, the heart recognizes something long before the mind has a chance to understand it. You may walk into a place you've never visited before and feel an immediate pull, an inexplicable sense of comfort, or longing, or even sorrow. The air feels familiar. The light falls in a way that stirs a memory you cannot quite name. You know, with quiet certainty, that you have never stood in this room or walked this path in your waking life. And yet a part of you whispers, "I remember this." These emotional reactions are often dismissed as imagination or nostalgia without a source. But there are times when the feeling runs deeper than that, when it arrives with such intensity that it almost takes your breath. You may meet someone for the first time and feel as though a story already exists between you, a story that has not yet unfolded here, but feels strangely complete somewhere else. The connection may be warm, or heavy, or bittersweet, as if your heart is retrieving an emotional memory from a life you have not lived. These moments can be confusing. Why should a stranger evoke grief, or tenderness, or trust? Why should a place you've never seen echo with familiarity? Logical explanations exist. Perhaps the person reminds you of someone from your past, or the place resembles a childhood memory. And while these explanations often hold truth, there are times when the emotional depth is too disproportionate to fit neatly into ordinary reasoning. Some describe these emotional encounters as first meetings wrapped in old feelings. The connection feels immediate, as if skipping the usual steps of introduction and easing directly into something intimate. A sense of recognition lingers in your chest, not tied to any specific detail but woven through the entire moment like a faint perfume from a long-forgotten morning. If we imagine consciousness as something wider than a single lifetime, then emotional resonance may become one of the clearest channels through which different versions of you communicate. Unlike thoughts, which are delicate and easily tangled, emotions carry a kind of raw, distilled truth. They are less bound by logic, more direct, more elemental. In this way, they may travel more easily across the hidden layers of possibility. You might consider these emotions as packets of feeling, small bundles of experience carried not in words but in sensation. If a parallel self has lived through a profound connection with someone, or learned something important within a place that resembles the one you're standing in now, the emotional imprint of that experience might reach you in a softened form, not as a memory, but as an instinct, a quiet pull in the heart, a sudden knowing without explanation. Imagine standing at the edge of a coastline you have never visited. The wind carries a scent you do not recognize, yet your chest tightens with a feeling that is unmistakably yours. You cannot recall the source. The origin lies beyond the borders of this life, perhaps belonging to a version of you who once lived by a similar sea in another thread of time. The feeling is not a message, but a reflection, an echo from a distant room in the house of your wider self. These emotional echoes do not only bring comfort, sometimes they bring grief, the kind that arrives suddenly, like a wave crashing against your ribs. You might meet someone and feel a strange sorrow, as though you're remembering a loss that has not occurred here. The grief may be brief, a small tremor in your chest, or it may linger, leaving you puzzled about its source. This grief may belong not to your own history, but to another version of you who has already walked a difficult path with this person. Similarly, you may experience a sudden warmth towards someone you have only just met, a sense of closeness that defies logic, a feeling that you know them, not who they appear to be now, but who they become in a different unfolding of events. This warmth may be the emotional residue of a deep bond shared by another version of you, a bond that stretches across timelines like a thread of light. These emotions are not instructions. They do not dictate your choices. They simply offer a glimpse, soft, incomplete, but meaningful. They hint that your life is part of a wider constellation, connected not by memory but by resonance. You may have had the experience of meeting someone and feeling instantly protective of them, without knowing why, or feeling a strange frustration before they have done anything to justify it, or feeling peace in their presence, as if recognizing a long-lost friend. These reactions may arise from psychological projection or from patterns learned long ago, but occasionally they feel like something more, like the faint stirring of emotional knowledge from a version of you who has already walked beside this person in another life. Places can carry this emotional depth too. A city street may fill you with longing, as if you once knew the rhythm of its mornings. A quiet clearing in the woods may fill you with calm, as though you have rested there in a dream or in a life that never unfolded here. These feelings are not proof of anything supernatural, but they invite a gentler interpretation, that your heart is capable of recognizing emotional truths even when your mind cannot trace their origin. Think of emotions as a kind of compass, not one that points north or south, but one that points toward resonance. When you feel a strong pull toward a person or place, the compass may be aligning with something meaningful, either within your own subconscious or across the wider landscape of parallel experiences. If the many worlds idea is true, then each version of you carries a lifetime of emotions, lessons, and connections. Most of these remain separated by the quiet boundaries of possibility. But sometimes, the wall between them thins. In those moments, the emotional imprints of another self may drift into your awareness, not fully formed but present enough to move you. The feeling is real, even if the story behind it is hidden. And so, when you find yourself drawn to someone for reasons you cannot explain, or moved by a place you have never seen before, you might pause and let the emotion speak softly, not to interpret it, not to search for meaning, but to feel its texture, the warmth, the ache, the familiarity. That sensation may be the truest part of the message. As we continue, we drift toward another gentle sign, one that appears not in people or places, but in the stories and songs that seem to arrive at the perfect moment, as if nudged into your path by a parallel hand. There are days when you open a book at random, and the very first sentence your eyes fall upon feels like it was written solely for you, addressing the question you've been quietly carrying, or illuminating a truth you were not ready to admit until that moment. Or perhaps a film you choose on a whim ends up mirroring the dilemma you haven't told anyone about, unfolding a story that seems to anticipate your next thought before you've even thought it. And sometimes, a song arrives out of nowhere at the exact moment your mind reaches towards something fragile. A dream you've held in silence, a fear you've tucked away, a memory you've tried not to revisit. These are the moments when the world feels, if only for a breath, like a conversation. Not a loud one, not a grand one, but a whispering conversation, where the universe gently drifts certain narratives into your reach, as if nudging a book across a table or placing a melody in the air right when your heart is soft enough to hear it. These experiences are subtle, easily overlooked, yet strangely precise. They feel like alignment, not between you and the outside world, but between the inner landscape of your emotions and the patterns unfolding around you. Media resonance is the term some people use for this phenomenon, though the phrase itself can sound more technical than the experience deserves. What truly happens is much more intimate. It is as if stories recognize you. They tap your shoulder gently, saying, "Here is something you need to see." And even though the story may be fictional, its timing feels real, its relevance uncanny. Imagine, for example, coming across a poem that captures exactly what you've been unable to articulate, even to yourself, or stumbling into an article that outlines the very crossroads you've been approaching, or hearing a lyric that wraps itself around your heart like an arm placed gently across your shoulders. These moments do not feel accidental. They feel orchestrated, not in any literal or mystical sense, but in the way that your inner world and outer world suddenly move in parallel, like two dancers finding the same rhythm. There are simple explanations for this. When something weighs on your mind, your attention orients itself toward anything remotely connected to it. A book that might otherwise seem unrelated suddenly feels meaningful because your emotions are primed to receive its message. This sensitivity creates the impression that certain media finds you at the right moment, when in reality you are the one noticing what you need to notice. But sometimes the timing feels too gentle, too perfect, too elegantly placed to dismiss entirely. A character's words may echo a thought you had earlier that morning. A scene from a show may mirror an unresolved conflict within you. A chorus may lift precisely when your heart was sinking. Even if these moments can be explained through psychology or chance, their emotional precision creates a sense of tenderness, as though the world is not indifferent to your quiet inner struggles. If we widen the lens and imagine the presence of parallel selves, media resonance becomes even more intriguing. Perhaps stories reach you not only because your own thoughts guide your attention, but because another version of you, living another timeline, has already walked through the pattern you're just beginning to see. Their emotional imprint may travel across the deeper layers of consciousness, guiding your awareness to the symbols, narratives, or scenes that resonate most with your current path. Picture consciousness as a broad field with many layers, each belonging to a different version of you. Some layers are close together, others farther apart, but they all share an underlying structure, the way threads in a tapestry share the same loom. If one version of you encounters a powerful insight through a story, perhaps a lesson about love, forgiveness, courage, or truth, the emotional residue of that insight may ripple outward through the shared field. And when that ripple brushes against the surface of your awareness, it may draw your attention towards stories in your timeline that carry a similar message. That doesn't mean a parallel self is directing your choices or sending specific instructions. It is not communication in any literal sense. It is more like resonance, like two strings vibrating at slightly different frequencies finding harmony together. When your emotional state aligns with the nearby version of yourself, the stories that echo that alignment may appear in your world with surprising clarity. You might have noticed that these moments often happen during transitions, when you're standing at the edge of a decision or in the delicate space between endings and beginnings. At such times, the heart becomes more porous, more receptive to guidance no matter where that guidance comes from. Stories, songs, and scenes that might have felt ordinary a week earlier suddenly feel luminous, or pointed, or strangely precise, as though they were placed along your path not by chance, but by a gentle hand that knows exactly what you need to hear. Sometimes the guidance is comforting. A character overcomes a fear you've been carrying. A lyric speaks directly to the part of you that feels lost. A passage in a book reminds you that healing is possible, even if slow. But sometimes the guidance is challenging. A scene exposes a truth you've been avoiding. A story confronts you with a mirror you weren't ready to face. A film forces you to consider a perspective you would rather ignore. These moments are just as valuable. They show that resonance does not always flatter. Sometimes it shakes you awake, but always the resonance is gentle. It does not force itself upon you. It appears when you are ready, when your awareness has softened enough to receive something meaningful. This timing is what makes these moments feel almost designed. They arrive not too early, not too late, but exactly when your inner world whispers, now. There is another layer to this phenomenon, one that belongs to the quieter corners of consciousness. Some people feel that when these media moments arrive, they carry an emotional signature that does not feel entirely like their own, a tinge of familiarity that seems to come from somewhere else. This feeling may be the faintest echo of a parallel self, whose own experiences with a similar story are drifting through the shared field of awareness. Whether or not you believe in parallel worlds, the effect of media resonance remains the same. It reminds you that you are connected to your emotions, connected to your intuition, and connected to the stories that wander across your path. It reminds you that the world is full of signs, not because someone places them there, but because your heart recognizes them when you are ready. And as we drift into the next sign, we turn from these soft patterns in the world to a quieter, more urgent signal, a feeling that rises not from stories or songs, but from the center of your being, as though carried across timelines by a self who has already lived the consequences you're about to face. There are moments in life when a feeling rises inside you with a quiet urgency, an instinct that doesn't shout but speaks in a steady, insistent tone. Perhaps you suddenly feel the need to call someone you haven't spoken to in years, and when you do, you discover they were going through something heavy and needed exactly that moment of connection. Or perhaps you have the impulse to change your route home for no obvious reason, only to find out later that your usual path would have placed you in the middle of something unsafe. These nudges often come without explanation, appearing softly but unmistakably, like a hand resting gently on your shoulder and urging you to pause, turn, or act before a window closes. Unlike ordinary intuition, which drifts in and out like weather, these moments carry a distinct texture. They feel charged, as if time itself has tightened around the moment. You may not understand why you feel compelled to act, but you feel the pressure of timing. A quiet inner voice says, now. Not later, not tomorrow, now. And if you ignore the feeling, it lingers in your thoughts like a faint echo, as though you missed a doorway that briefly opened and then dissolved back into the wall. In everyday life, we often explain such moments as the result of pattern recognition, a kind of mental whisper created by noticing small details without consciously realizing it. The mind is always processing more information than you are aware of, and sometimes it assembles those hidden details into a feeling of urgency before your conscious thoughts catch up. This explanation is both comforting and true in many situations, but there are times when the feeling cannot be traced to any observable clue. It appears suddenly, with no hint in your surroundings, yet with clarity so strong it feels like memory. And that is perhaps the most unique feature of these urgent nudges. They do not feel like predictions. They feel like recollections, like something has already happened, or almost happened, in a place you cannot see. The emotional quality is not one of imagining the future, but remembering a consequence. People often describe these moments as having a strange familiarity, as if they are living through a second attempt at a moment that once went differently. It is as though, somewhere, on another branch of reality, a version of you already made the choice you are now facing and lived through the result. In that version of the moment, perhaps something was lost or something painful unfolded. And now that emotional imprint travels across the deeper layers of consciousness, arriving as a warning, a tug, a whisper that carries the weight of experience. If we imagine timelines as separate paths in a dense forest, then urgent intuitions might be like hearing a distant voice calling from a path just out of sight. Not in words, but in emotional tone. You cannot see what happened there, but you can feel the urgency behind the call. The air changes, your breath shortens. Something inside you knows that the moment matters, even if you cannot articulate why. Some people experience these nudges during life-changing decisions. Whether to accept a job, end a relationship, move to a new place, or take a leap into something unknown. At such crossroads, the urgency can feel almost physical. A pressure in the chest, a tug behind the sternum, a stirring in the gut. Even if logic argues against acting on the feeling, the emotional pull remains strong, as though another version of you is saying, "I've been down this road. Trust me." There are also quieter versions of these nudges, moments when you feel an inexplicable need to check on a pet, or return to a store where you left something behind, or reread a message you brushed aside. These moments may seem small, even trivial, but when you follow them, you sometimes find that they save you from trouble or open a possibility you would have missed. The idea of timeline windows can be helpful here, not as a technical description, but as a gentle metaphor. Imagine that your life is full of doors that appear only once in a long while. Some are wide open, offering you time to step through. Others open only for a brief moment, like a glimmer in the corner of your vision. These doors lead to paths that can shape your story in meaningful ways, and once they close, they may not open again. When an intuitive nudge arrives with urgency, it may be because one of these windows is about to open or close. This does not imply fate or destiny in a rigid sense. It simply suggests that your awareness is sensitive to the unfolding of possibility. You may feel the tension around a moment, the sense that something is shifting, that a choice carries weight, that now is the time to move or to stay. Whether this awareness comes from your own subconscious or from the emotional residues of parallel selves, the experience feels the same, a quiet but unmistakable call to action. These nudges often feel clearest when your mind is still. In the silence of early morning, on a long walk, in the few seconds before sleep, in moments when you're not distracted by noise or routine, your awareness becomes more receptive to subtle signals that may travel across the folds of consciousness, carrying faint echoes of paths already walked elsewhere. It is important to note that these urgencies do not always point to danger. Sometimes they guide you towards something good, an opportunity, a person, a moment of connection. You may feel compelled to visit a cafe you rarely go to, and there you run into someone who changes the trajectory of your life. You may feel a sudden urge to begin a project you have been postponing, and you discover that the timing could not have been better. These moments often feel serendipitous, but beneath the surface, they carry the emotional signature of alignment, a path opening at just the right moment. If we imagine that parallel selves exist, each exploring a different strand of your potential, then some of those selves may have already walked toward the very thing you're hesitating to approach. Their emotional knowledge may reach you in the form of a nudge, not a command but a quiet reassurance, a whisper from a version of you who has already learned that this step leads somewhere important. Whether or not parallel selves play a role, the value of these intuitive urgencies remains. They remind you to pay attention to your inner world. They remind you that timing matters, that some moments carry a rare clarity, and that listening to those gentle warnings or invitations may guide you toward a version of your life that feels more aligned, more authentic, and more awake. And with this final sign, the 7 whispers come together. Dreams, déjà vu, synchronicities, sudden insight, emotional resonance, meaningful stories, and urgent intuition. Each one is subtle, like a feather brushing across your awareness, but together they form a pattern that invites us to ask not only what these signs mean, but how such delicate signals might move across the vast landscape of consciousness in the first place. There are ideas in science that feel less like theories and more like nighttime stories, concepts that, when held gently, don't demand certainty but invite wonder. One of the softest among them is the idea that consciousness might not be a tiny flame sealed inside the skull, but something broader, something that stretches, like a quiet glow that extends a little beyond the edges of your body, not bright, not forceful, but subtle, like the faint warmth of your hands lingering in the air even after you move them. If you imagine consciousness this way, as a gentle field instead of a rigid boundary, then many of life's strangest moments begin to feel a little less strange. Intuition, synchronicity, déjà vu. They stop feeling like glitches in the mind and begin feeling like ripples moving through this glow, ripples that may come from deeper places within you, or perhaps from the many versions of you that exist in the wide landscape of possibility. To understand this, picture a very still pond under moonlight. When you toss a pebble into the water, ripples move outward in widening circles. Now imagine that somewhere across the pond another pebble falls, creating its own set of ripples. When the waves meet, they blend, not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, creating patterns neither pebble could make alone. Some scientists describe reality this way, not as a fixed structure, but as a vast surface where events create ripples that interact in ways we cannot always see. The mind, in this view, is not separate from the pond, it is part of it. Your thoughts, emotions, and awareness are not just internal events, they are ripples too. And this makes the world feel a little more connected. Your choices might shape the currents you walk through. Your attention might shift the direction in which those currents flow. Even small decisions, whether to speak or stay quiet, whether to turn left or right, might gently influence which ripples become part of your experience. This is a softer way to imagine how probability works in the universe, not as a cold concept filled with numbers and calculations, but as the movement of countless small currents, each one flowing toward the path of least resistance. When you feel drawn strongly toward one choice over another, it may be because the currents beneath your awareness are already shifting, creating a subtle pull. Some thinkers believe that attention itself has weight, not physical weight, but a kind of presence that lightly encourages certain possibilities to unfold. You don't force them into existence, you simply lean toward them, and in leaning, you help shape the path. This idea becomes even more interesting when you imagine many versions of yourself leaning in different directions across different branches of reality. Each version creates its own patterns, its own ripples, and perhaps in rare and quiet moments, the ripples from those other versions brush against your own. Imagine two lanterns placed far apart in a dark valley. If a gentle wind blows across them, their flames may flicker in the same rhythm even without seeing each other. Some physicists use this image when describing how two distant things can behave in harmony, as if connected by something deeper than space. You don't need to think of it as a scientific mechanism. You can simply imagine that some forms of connection do not require physical proximity. They travel through the deeper layers of reality, like a shared breath. When many people focus their attention at the same time, during moments of collective emotion like meditation, celebration, or grief, some researchers have noticed subtle shifts in things that are supposed to be entirely random. Think of machines designed to generate unpredictable numbers, like rain on a rooftop falling without pattern. But in certain moments, these machines seem to lean toward patterns, as if the emotional state of many hearts beating together creates a ripple large enough to brush the surface of randomness itself. You do not need to accept this as fact. You only need to hold the idea gently, that perhaps consciousness has a quiet influence on the world, and that when many minds resonate together, the world listens in its own small way. Even if these effects are subtle and fleeting, they hint that awareness is not passive. It participates. It moves. It touches the world the way light touches water. Now imagine this on a more personal scale. If consciousness is something spacious, something that extends beyond the boundary of the skin, then perhaps your awareness is not limited to the experiences of this single version of your life. Perhaps the deeper layers of your mind are connected to the deeper layers of other possibilities, other paths where other versions of you have made different choices, learned different lessons, traveled different emotional landscapes. The signals that travel across these layers would not arrive as sentences or images. They would arrive as feelings, intuitions, gentle pushes. They would feel like inner guidance, quiet, persistent, impossible to explain logically, yet deeply meaningful. They would feel like déjà vu, synchronicity, sudden insight, or that sense of urgency that tells you a small moment matters. In this way, the quiet machinery of reality becomes not just a scientific curiosity, but a kind of emotional architecture. A place where the ripples of all your possible selves interact. A place where the choices you make whisper to other versions of you, and where their choices whisper back. You might think of these whispers as tiny lanterns in the dark, flickering, subtle, but present. They do not overwhelm. They do not command, they simply glow, reminding you that you're part of a larger field of possibility, woven through with currents you can sometimes feel even if you cannot name them. As we continue down this gentle path, we move toward the next step, learning how to recognize these subtle ripples, how to distinguish quiet signals from the noise of fear or expectation, and how to listen to the whispers of possibility without forcing them. Letting them come the way wind arrives across an open field, softly, in their own time. There is a quiet art to listening, not the kind of listening we use in ordinary conversation, but the deeper listening that happens inside the mind. This listening is subtle, almost like tuning an old radio. At first, you hear mostly static, the buzz of your worries, the hum of daily responsibilities, the faint crackle of old memories and imagined futures. But then, every once in a while, you catch a moment of clarity, a soft note drifting through the noise, brief but unmistakably different. That small, delicate signal is what this session is about. If the world does contain gentle whispers from deeper layers of yourself, from intuition, from emotion, or from the quiet resonance of parallel lives, then hearing those whispers requires a kind of sensitivity. Not sensitivity in the emotional sense, but in the perceptual sense. Sensitivity as attunement, as calibration, as learning the difference between a real, meaningful ripple and the restless waves created by your own mind. One of the simplest ways to begin cultivating this sensitivity is through a period of gentle observation. Not analysis, not self-judgment, just observation. For 2 weeks, some people choose to keep a soft record of their dreams, their intuitive nudges, their sudden emotional shifts, and the small coincidences that catch their attention. They do not assign meaning, they do not interpret, they simply notice. This phase is like learning the natural rhythm of a forest. Before you can identify unusual sounds, you must become familiar with the everyday ones: the rustling of leaves, the movement of birds, the creak of branches. In the same way, before you can recognize a true inner signal, you need to understand your mind's ordinary patterns. You need to notice what anxiety feels like, what hope feels like, what anticipation feels like, so that when a different kind of feeling arrives, one with a quieter, steadier tone, you can recognize it as something distinct. At first, everything will feel the same. Noise and signal blend together, but gradually a difference emerges. Emotional resonance feels smooth, calm, grounded. Emotional projection, when your wishes or fears create the impression of a sign, feels urgent, shaky, or heavy. Projection shouts, resonance whispers. A true signal often arrives without drama. It does not push, it does not insist, it simply appears, like a feather drifting into your palm. You may feel it as a shift in your breathing, or as a momentary stillness in your thoughts. It may be a clarity that rises without effort, or a gentle certainty that you do not need to justify. The body often knows before the mind does. Your breath relaxes, something softens behind your ribs. The sensation is subtle but unmistakable once you have felt it enough times. Stress, on the other hand, creates static. When you're anxious or overwhelmed, everything feels significant. Every coincidence becomes a sign. Every emotion feels like a warning. This is one of the reasons true signals often appear during moments of calm, when the internal waters are still enough for the faint ripples of intuition to be seen. When stress lowers, sensitivity naturally increases, and with increased sensitivity, synchronicities become easier to distinguish from ordinary noise. Another part of calibrated sensitivity involves noticing patterns over time rather than reacting to isolated moments. A single coincidence can be noise, a single intuition can be projection. But when the same theme appears over and over, when dreams align with intuitions, and intuitions align with synchronicities, and synchronicities align with emotional clarity, something deeper may be unfolding. True signals often ride on the currents of repetition, but their repetition is gentle, unexpected, almost artistic. Like hearing the same melody played by different instruments over several days. Some people describe the early stages of this process as frustrating. They worry they are imagining everything or misinterpreting every feeling. But the process is not about perfection. It is about familiarity. Sensitivity grows slowly, like eyesight adjusting to dim light. The longer you sit in the quiet, the more you can see, and over time, a kind of inner refinement develops. You begin to sense when a feeling is coming from a deep place inside you versus when it is arising from fear, desire, or memory. Deep signals feel older, steadier. They have a softness that projection lacks. Parallel communication, if it exists, follows this same principle. It does not demand attention. It does not ring loud bells. It arrives through the same channels as intuition, emotion, dreams, synchronicity, insight. It blends so naturally with your inner world that you can only perceive it when you are listening softly. And as you practice listening, something interesting happens. What once felt like rare, strange moments of clarity begin to appear more often. Not constantly, not overwhelmingly, but more naturally. The communication becomes less like decoding hidden messages and more like noticing the wind. You don't have to force anything. You don't have to chase anything. You simply remain open, and signals, whether from your deepest subconscious or from nearby branches of possibility, find their way to you when the conditions are right. There is a wisdom in remembering that these signals never command. They never corner you. They never threaten. They invite. They nudge. They offer a gentle movement in the direction of clarity. If a voice inside you feels forceful, panicked, or absolute, it is rarely the deep voice. The deep voice is patient. It waits. It gives you space. It respects your autonomy. It respects your timing. And so, calibrated sensitivity becomes less about sharpening your mind and more about softening it. Less about analysis, more about presence. Less about searching for signs, more about noticing them when they naturally arise. The mind becomes like a quiet field, open to the smallest movements of wind, receptive to the faintest shimmer of light. Once you step into this way of listening, you may find that the world begins to speak to you in subtle ways, not loudly, but clearly enough for you to hear, and with that, you become ready for the next part of the journey. Not just noticing the signals, but learning gentle practices, dream work, writing, meditation that make those signals easier to receive, like opening small inner doorways to deeper layers of yourself. There are moments in life when guidance seems to drift toward you naturally, through dreams, through intuition, through coincidences that arrive like faint footprints in freshly fallen snow. But there are also times when the mind feels closed, when the noise of daily life grows thick, and those delicate signals have trouble reaching you. During those times, certain practices can help open a little more space inside you, soft inner doorways that make it easier for quiet insights to enter. These practices are not rituals or rigid techniques, they are invitations. They work best when approached with gentleness, with curiosity, and without demanding any particular outcome. Think of them as ways of tuning a musical instrument rather than forcing a performance. You're simply adjusting the strings of your awareness so they resonate more easily with the subtle movements of your inner world. One place to begin is dream work, because dreams remain the most natural bridge between the conscious and the deeper layers of mind. In dreams, the usual boundaries soften. The mind becomes a canvas where images and emotions blend freely, without the tight structure of waking logic. When you become curious about your dreams, not to analyze them, but simply to notice them, you begin opening a quiet channel that can carry intuitive signals more clearly. Some people like to whisper a simple intention before falling asleep, not a command, not a request for visions, but a gentle invitation such as, "If there's something I need to understand, let it come to me softly." This small gesture is like opening a window just enough to let the night air drift in. It signals to the deeper layers of your mind that you are listening. You don't need to force anything. If you wake remembering only a feeling, warmth, sadness, curiosity, that is enough. If a dream repeats, or if a place returns, or if a face you've never met keeps appearing, you may notice that these patterns are not random. They are part of the subtle language the dreaming mind uses when it wants to draw your attention to something important. Over time, these dreams may become clearer, more coherent, almost like chapters in a quiet book written just for you. Another pathway into deeper awareness is a practice often called automatic writing, though you can think of it more simply as free-flow writing. It works like this. You sit down with a pen and paper or an open document, take a slow breath, and allow your hand to move without planning your words. You do not edit. You do not evaluate. You write as though you are listening to someone speak in another room, distant, gentle, but steady. At first, the words may feel tangled. They may sound like ordinary thoughts or even nonsense. But as you continue, you may notice moments where the tone shifts slightly, as though another current of thought has entered the room. The sentences may become calmer, clearer, or wiser. They may carry a softness or perspective that feels unfamiliar but comforting, like a breeze entering a still space. These shifts are not supernatural. They simply reflect parts of your mind that rarely speak above a whisper, the deeper parts that hold intuition, insight, and emotional memory. This writing is not meant to predict the future or answer specific questions. It is meant to help you listen. Often, what appears on the page are feelings or truths you have known quietly for a long time, yet avoided acknowledging. Other times, the words seem to come from a version of yourself who has learned something difficult and wants to share that learning gently with you. Whether you think of that other voice as your subconscious or a parallel self is not important. What matters is the calm, steady clarity it brings. Meditation is another doorway, though many people misunderstand it as something that requires perfect stillness or empty thoughts. In reality, meditation is more like sitting beside a river and watching the water flow. Thoughts drift through, one after another, and you simply notice them without grabbing onto them. The goal is not to stop thinking, but to shift from being inside your thoughts to gently observing them. When you sit quietly like this, respiration slowing, attention softening, the layers of mental noise gradually thin, the river becomes clearer. Beneath the surface, subtle feelings begin to rise. Sometimes an image appears, an archway, a garden, a room you've never visited but can see in vivid detail. Sometimes you hear an inner phrase spoken in a voice that feels both yours and not entirely yours. These moments are not hallucinations or fantasies. They are the mind expressing itself through its most ancient language, imagery. Some people like to visualize a meeting place during meditation, a peaceful clearing, a warm lit room, a garden bench overlooking an endless horizon. A place where they can sit with a deeper version of themselves. This is not literal. You're not summoning spirits or contacting other worlds. It is simply a way of making space inside your mind for insight to appear in symbolic form. The setting gives the deeper layers of consciousness a quiet stage on which to speak. You can imagine opening a small door or sitting beneath a tree whose branches are filled with soft, glowing fruit. You can imagine stepping into a hallway lined with books or descending a staircase carved into ancient stone. The imagery does not matter. What matters is that it feels calm and safe. When the mind feels safe, it reveals more. Another essential part of this listening practice is learning to distinguish intuition from fear or fantasy. Intuition typically feels steady, grounded, and quiet. Fear, on the other hand, feels urgent, loud, and demanding. Fantasy feels airy, bright, fragile, often dissolving the moment you try to look at it directly. True intuitive signals do not spin elaborate stories. They offer simple guidance. This feels right, or this feels wrong, or wait. And woven through all of this, the dreams, the writing, the meditative imagery, is a gentle reminder to take care of your mental well-being. These practices open inner spaces, and inner spaces can be tender places. If you ever feel overwhelmed, unsteady, or confused, stepping back is an act of wisdom. These techniques are not meant to replace therapy, medical guidance, or grounded decision-making. They are simply tools for listening more deeply to yourself. When approached slowly, gently, without expectation, these practices can help the faintest signals reach you. Signals from your intuition, from your emotional truth, and perhaps from other versions of your story that exist in the wide landscape of possibility. As we drift into the next part of our journey, we move from technique to meaning, exploring what it might feel like to heal across timelines and to see yourself as part of a larger chorus of parallel selves, each holding its own fragment of wisdom. There are times in life when healing feels distant, almost like a faint star barely visible from where you stand. You may know that healing is possible in theory, and yet the path toward it seems tangled, filled with old patterns, old wounds, old memories that rise like shadows when the mind grows quiet. But there is a softer way to think about healing, one that doesn't require forcing or rushing. It begins with imagining that you are not alone in your journey, even within yourself. If the universe does indeed hold many versions of your life, countless timelines where small choices grew into big differences, then somewhere, in the vast forest of possibilities, There are versions of you who have already walked through the difficulties you're facing. Versions who survived the heartbreak you are suffering now. Versions who learned to let go of the same fear that grips your chest. Versions who found the courage you seek, the clarity you long for, or the peace that feels just out of reach. This idea does not ask you to believe in parallel worlds in any literal way. Instead, it offers a gentle metaphor that within the wide range of who you could become, there are selves who carry the wisdom of paths you have not yet walked. These selves can serve as guides, not by speaking, not by appearing, but through the emotional resonance that travels across the quieter layers of consciousness. Their lessons may reach you as subtle certainties, as comforting impressions, or as an unexpected softening in moments when you feel most overwhelmed. Imagine for a moment that all possible versions of you form a kind of quiet constellation. Each one is a point of light in the dark sky of potential. Some stars are dim, carrying stories of struggle. Others glow more brightly, carrying stories of healing, triumph, and growth. You are one of these stars, one glowing point among many. And when you look within, you may feel the gentle warmth of another star's light touching yours, not as instruction, not as direction, but as possibility. Healing in this sense becomes a meeting of selves, your present self extending a hand backward or forward across the landscape of possibility, and your wiser selves reaching back toward you. Their wisdom does not arrive as sentences, it arrives as a shift in perspective, a breath that feels easier, a moment when a problem that once felt heavy suddenly feels lighter. It may arrive as forgiveness, soft and unexpected, or as a sudden compassion for the parts of yourself you once criticized. Sometimes, the healing begins with something as simple as a change in tone, the voice inside your mind growing kinder, more patient. In moments like this, you may be tapping into emotional patterns that another version of you has already strengthened. In some life, on some path, you have learned how to speak to yourself gently, and that voice may drift toward you now, especially in moments when you need it most. Think of trauma as a shape carved into the surface of your heart. Over time, that shape becomes familiar, so familiar that you may begin to believe it is permanent. But in another possibility, a different you has lived through the same pain and has found a way to smooth the rough edges of that shape. Their healing does not erase what happened, but transforms its meaning. When this emotional transformation drifts across the deeper layers of consciousness, you may feel it as hope you cannot explain, or as strength that seems to arrive from nowhere. Relationships, too, carry echoes across possibilities. Perhaps in this life you are struggling to communicate with someone you care about, but in another version you found the right words at the right moment. You learned how to listen with openness rather than defense. You discovered a gentler rhythm. The feeling of that rhythm, its patience, its tenderness, may reach you now as the faint outline of a better way. Or perhaps you have lost someone, and the grief feels like a storm you cannot step out of. In another timeline, you may have walked through that storm already, learned to live with the absence, and reached a place where remembrance brings warmth instead of pain. The emotional imprint of that healing may visit you in quiet moments. A sudden stillness, a deeper breath, a tiny flicker of peace. These flickers are small, but they matter. They remind you that healing is not a single moment. It is a slow opening, a gradual return to yourself. One of the most tender ideas in this view of healing is the notion of self-compassion. When you imagine yourself as one note within a wide, beautiful chord of possibilities, it becomes easier to let go of harsh judgment. You realize that the you who struggles today is not lesser than the you who thrives in another life. They are simply at different points in the same unfolding. And just as you would treat a younger version of yourself with gentleness, you can treat this present version with the same care. Ethical grounding becomes essential here. The purpose of imagining parallel selves is not to escape responsibility or to romanticize alternate lives. It is not a way to avoid healing or to justify harmful behaviour. Instead, it is a way to bring kindness into the process, a reminder that you are a work in progress and that many paths lead toward the same light. Free will in this gentle framework becomes the act of choosing which branch of yourself you wish to nourish. You may not control every event in your life, but you can lean toward the self you wish to become. You can choose actions, thoughts, and emotions that align with the versions of you that are wiser, calmer, more compassionate. Each choice is a small step toward the timeline that feels most true. Healing across possibilities is not about reaching into other worlds. It is about expanding the definition of who you think you are, about recognizing that your potential is vast and that within that potential exist many paths where you have already overcome the pain you feel today. The emotional echoes of those paths can help guide you forward, one breath, one shift, one softened moment at a time. And as this part of our journey draws to a close, we begin to gather all the threads together: dreams, intuition, synchronicities, probability, healing, into one final gentle reflection on what it means to be a single self, moving through a universe full of possibilities. As our long, gentle journey drifts toward its close, you may notice a kind of softness settling in the mind, a quiet sense that tonight has not been about finding answers, but about opening small windows into dreams that feel like memories, into déjà vu that feels like a meeting between timelines, into synchronicities that feel like the world breathing in a rhythm with you, into intuition that feels older than your own thoughts, and into the possibility that you're not one single story, but a constellation of stories, all connected through the quiet glow of consciousness. If the many worlds idea is a vast forest of branching paths, then you, right now in this moment, are one traveller moving along one path. But this traveller is not alone. Around you, though you cannot see them, are countless parallel versions of your life. Some brighter, some heavier, some more peaceful, some more challenging. Each one is a different exploration of who you could become. Each one carries its own lessons, its own mistakes, its own victories. And even though these lives do not cross in any physical way, their emotional resonances sometimes drift across the boundaries of possibility, touching your awareness like faint echoes from a distant room. All throughout this journey we explored how those echoes might appear, dreams that feel like glimpses of another life, sudden insights that arrive already formed, emotional connections that feel older than the moment, stories that find you at precisely the right time, and intuitive nudges that carry the weight of experiences you have not yet lived. Whether these whispers come from parallel selves or from the deep chambers of your own subconscious, their impact remains the same. They help you find your way. They illuminate corners of your life that need attention. They soften your fears. They call your awareness toward moments that matter. And perhaps that is the quiet truth at the heart of all of this. Guidance does not always shout from the mountaintop. Sometimes it arrives like a feather falling onto your palm. Sometimes it appears as a pattern in the world, or a dream you carry into waking. Sometimes it feels like the emotional glow of a future self, or the memory of a choice you have not yet made. These whispers do not force your hand. They do not trap you in destiny. They simply show you where the light is, so you can walk toward it in your own time. One of the gentlest gifts of imagining a universe filled with many versions of yourself is the way it reframes loneliness. In difficult moments, it is easy to feel isolated within your struggles. But when you imagine that somewhere, on another path, in another branch, a version of you has already healed, already grown, already found serenity, the feeling of isolation softens. You begin to sense that you are part of something larger than the story you are currently living, that you belong to a family of selves, each one learning something useful, each one sending back emotional signals that help the others along. This idea can bring comfort, but it also carries a small responsibility. It reminds you to be gentle with yourself, to treat this version of your life with kindness, to understand that you are simply in one chapter of a much larger book. Whatever you are facing now, whatever uncertainty or grief or longing, does not define you. It is part of the unfolding, but not the whole. Somewhere in the vast network of possibility, there are versions of you who have already walked through this moment. They know its weight, they know its lessons, and their emotional wisdom can reach you as a quiet, steady encouragement. You might picture this not as communication, but as resonance, like tuning forks that vibrate when placed close together. When you lean toward healing, you may feel the vibration of another self who is already healed. When you lean toward courage, you may feel the calm strength of a self who has already acted bravely. When you lean toward forgiveness, you may sense the warm echo of a self who is already forgiven. These echoes are not instructions. They are gentle reminders that the capacity already exists within you. As you carry these thoughts into the rest of your evening, you might notice a small shift inside, a softer heartbeat, a quieter breath, a sense of being supported in unseen ways. You may feel more open to the subtle guidance that appears in your life, not as commands, but as possibilities, glimmers of direction in dreams, in intuition, in the patterns woven through your days. And whether these glimmers come from parallel selves or from the deep intelligence of your own mind, they are still gifts. They are reminders that reality is wider than it appears, and that consciousness is more spacious than the surface thoughts that rise and fall throughout the day. They are reminders that you are allowed to change, to grow, to choose the path that feels most aligned with who you want to become. Every choice you make is a small act of shaping the world around you. Every moment of reflection is a doorway into greater clarity. As the night deepens, you might let your mind drift gently through everything we've explored. The many branches of reality, the quiet machinery beneath experience, the subtle signals that brush against your awareness, and the idea that healing can flow across possibilities. Not in sharp instructions, but in soft emotional patterns that help you move closer to the life you want to live. And so, we reach the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for walking this quiet path with me. If you ever wish to listen again, or drift into another journey of gentle wonder, you're always welcome to return. No matter where you are, no matter which branch of your life you're standing on, you are not alone. Not in this timeline, and not in any other. May your night be peaceful, your dreams kind, and your heart at ease.